Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank you, Speaker, for granting this emergency debate tonight. And I want to thank my colleagues for being part of this. I want to say how much it meant to me that after the Conservatives requested an emergency debate following the terrible news that leaked out last night about General Motors' closure in Oshawa, it was heartening to see the NDP and the Liberals also request an emergency debate on this, and I see those colleagues, many of them in the House here tonight, because this is an event that needs to be addressed, and I'm glad, Madam Speaker, that your chair has provided this debate tonight, because it's an earth-shattering set of news that came out this morning with respect to GM Oshawa. The reverberations are being felt in Oshawa, in Bowmanville, in Whitby and Pickering, in the Greater Toronto area, but primarily in the Durham region, Madam Speaker. While my riding is called Durham, I don't claim to represent the entire region. There's many people in this House that are here to represent the residents of Durham, and we're all feeling the pain of the families impacted by the announcement of a closure of the GM assembly operation by the end of next year, Madam Speaker. I want to say at the outset of my remarks that we often talk about numbers in this House, large deficit numbers, number of people impacted, but every single number is a kitchen table. We've heard 2,600 layoffs today. Some people said as many as 4,000. A report filed a few years ago about the impact of the operations of General Motors Oshawa suggested the closure would lead to 33,000 direct and indirect job losses as a result of us stopping making automobiles in Oshawa. Those are numbers, but at the heart of every one of them is a family. A kitchen table where people will be talking tonight about the fact that mom or dad may be losing their job. And I don't think that's lost on anyone in this place, Madam Speaker, regardless of the side. And that's why an emergency debate, I hope, will address some of the underpinnings of the decision that went in to GM's announcement today, Madam Speaker, because I certainly think it was a bad decision and badly executed, but we can maybe address some of the underlying causes that led to it. I do also want to say that this is very personal for me as the Member of Parliament for Durham. I grew up in a GM household, Madam Speaker. My father, John, who later on went into provincial politics, I knew my dad as a guy that worked at GM. We used to go, like many families, to the forklift truck races held by the CAW, now Unifor, and the Christmas parties for families. And I saw my dad as one of 25,000 men or women at the time in the 70s and 80s that worked at General Motors Oshawa, Madam Speaker. So I know firsthand the impact this is having on the 3,000 or so directly impacted by the news today. But I also know that it's reverberating across the GTA, across Southern Ontario, to many of the retiree families and pensioners, Madam Speaker, because they're part of the GM family. And in fact, my private member's bill that I introduced was in part to give a little bit of certainty with respect to pensioners, many of whom GM pensioners that were very worried about their pension a few years ago, Madam Speaker. This personal impact, I think, is when Parliament functions at its best. Not only was my father an employee at General Motors, I worked there as a summer co-op student while I was a Bowmanville High School student in the battery plant, Madam Speaker. And the battery plant ceased to exist some time ago, but it was a great experience for a young person like myself to see a workforce in action, see the jobs that created the opportunity across our region, Madam Speaker. And I still remember the impact of that job for me. The engineer that I worked under, John Toomey, was a Royal Military College of Canada graduate, an engineer, and I saw the problem solving he brought to efficiency issues within that plant, and that was one of the factors that led me to look to the Royal Military College of Canada. The family tables I've said that are impacted by the announcement today, around those tables are also the bedrock of our community, Madam Speaker. The hockey coaches, the soccer coaches, the dance instructors, the Kiwanis members, the Rotarians, the Legion members. We've actually had in the Durham region generations of GM families that have been building our community. That has to be part of this debate, Madam Speaker, and why I'm glad all sides wanted to see this happening. These aren't just numbers. These are families. Their cumulative impact has shown that at least $1.1 billion each year on the Canadian GDP is a direct impact of GM of Oshawa, Madam Speaker. That study I talked about earlier that projected the risk of 33,000 job losses as a result of a GM Oshawa closure also said that the GDP of our country and the province of Ontario would drop over the 2 years following a closure in the amount of about $5.7 billion. As I said often, speaking about the challenge facing our resource sector, the resource sector in Western Canada benefits Ontario. And the success of the auto industry in Ontario has benefited all of Canada for a century or more, Madam Speaker. So these are the important national debates that we have to bring to this Parliament and we have to address as a team. I will speak for a minute about this 100-year origin, Madam Speaker. The plant itself is not a 100-year-old plant. I've heard that expression today. Let's wipe that away. The McLaughlin family, Madam Speaker, that were the origin of GM Canada and truly actually one of the founding partners of GM worldwide, were a small family from Inniskillen, Ontario, Madam Speaker, in my riding. And they made carriages for horse-drawn carts and vehicles as they were at that time. A remarkable family who lost one of their sons, who was a lawyer in the area in the Great War. One of the other members of the family created Canada Dry. This company was at the forefront of innovation in those late 1800s, early 1900s. And then my area, the town of Bowmanville, made a big mistake. They wouldn't lend the McLaughlin family some money. And so the McLaughlin family found their loan in Oshawa, and Oshawa became the city that motivates Canada, which was their slogan when I was young, Madam Speaker. The auto industry developed in Canada in Oshawa as a result of McLaughlin Carriage and then later McLaughlin Motor Works. The McLaughlin family then partnered with the Durant family of the United States, and the McLaughlin Buick became a key vehicle. Later on, they acquired Chevrolet, and the McLaughlin family was one of the original investors in General Motors, Madam Speaker. So that is the century of heritage, and that's what makes this so disappointing. Were it not for the presence of our industry in Oshawa a century ago, there would be no GM today. It's not lost on the families in our community, which have had not just 2, but in some cases 3 generations of their family working at General Motors. Now, does that mean they have to stay out of historic convention or out of feeling like they owe it to the community? No, Madam Speaker. We have to remain competitive. We have to show them that Oshawa is a place you want to continue to build vehicles for the future, Madam Speaker. And that's why we're having this debate tonight. The news today was less about there's no allocation of vehicle to Oshawa. The news was that Oshawa was not considered to be part of the future of General Motors. They didn't see it as part of their competitive ecosystem of making vehicles, assembling vehicles and their component parts, Madam Speaker. And that should concern people, because the men and women at General Motors in the past and in recent years have statistically been some of the most productive workers within the GM network of assembly plants. They have had the ability to respond and to be very competitive. And you know, Madam Speaker, for many years, a skilled workforce, a community that has supported the development and growth of GM, our healthcare system, which through the 60s provided a competitive advantage to manufacturing in Ontario, our dollar differential, Madam Speaker, all of these items were part of the competitive advantage that kept General Motors manufacturing vehicles in Canada. And I think, and why I think we need the emergency debate, is it concerned me today that the Prime Minister wanted to just turn the page and talk about how we have to support the families and the workers. I agree with him on that, Madam Speaker. But within mere hours of that announcement, I feel we, as the elected officials of the area, owe it to those families to at least say, what can we do in the next year to address the underlying conditions that made Oshawa appear as one of the facilities today listed, Madam Speaker. Now, I know that Oshawa has shrunk in size from the heyday when my father was there and I was a young kid, 25,000 men and women working there, but it remains a productive and effective facility. In fact, an adaptive facility, which just in the last few years, with investments and flexibility in the line, could produce sedans, it could produce trucks, Madam Speaker. So when I see news today that they want to pivot production to be electric, zero emission, zero collision, this is the type of flex facility that could easily pivot to that as well, Madam Speaker. I would also note that through our university, the University of Ontario Institute of Technology, or ONTech, as I like to call it, has world-class automotive supports, including the best and most advanced wind tunnel and research facility for automobiles in North America, Madam Speaker. We have a very advanced and progressive local distribution company for electricity, Viridian, Madam Speaker, which has been working on electric and hybrid car promotion within the region, Madam Speaker, working at making more spots available for GO train commuters, these sorts of things. We also have the Darlington Nuclear Generating Station, Madam Speaker, where we generate part of Ontario's electricity emission-free. So we could easily pivot, far easier than any other of the Great Lakes manufacturing facilities impacted, Madam Speaker, to a zero-emission, zero-collision, high-tech smart car system off the line in Oshawa. Why not, Madam Speaker? We owe it to the families to not just turn the page within hours. Let's work together on a plan to address the underlying decisions that led to Oshawa's inclusion, that despite 100 years of history, it's no longer going to be on the production schedule for the next 10, 20, 30 years, Madam Speaker. Let's look at what the conditions are and whether we can, as a team, address them. I've highlighted today because the Minister for Industry has been doing a lot of media. I appreciate the compassion he's shown, Madam Speaker, but I want to know what he has been hearing from General Motors, because that minister, as is the normal case, it was the same in the Conservative government, the industry minister, impacting job employers across the country, is usually one of the most regular met with, or I might say lobbied, Madam Speaker. Well, the company in the last few years that has met with him more than any other is General Motors. I'd like to know what underlying concerns they had, because if we can work on some of those concerns, you'll see the opposition supporting that, Madam Speaker. I fear that a cumulative effect of some things out of the hands of this government, in the hands of the provincial wind government, some of the moves they've made on labour rates, putting upward pressures, Madam Speaker, that contributed to an environment where power rates, labour rates were making Ontario less attractive to manufacturers. I heard that everywhere I traveled in the last few years, Madam Speaker. Add on top of that payroll tax increases a few years ago by this government, and potentially we have an environment where if we address some of these conditions, we can make it competitive again, Madam Speaker. I would also note that the government's carbon tax plan that they've levied would have exempted General Motors as a large emitter, Madam Speaker. As my colleague from Carleton noted today, perhaps the fact that they had to omit large emitters or risk the fact the emitters would leave because of competitiveness issues, that might be a sign that there was concern about a rush to a carbon tax at a time where there was no such tax in the United States. I've said For a few years in this House, Madam Speaker, the auto industry since the 1960s has been so integrated in Canada, it's really a Great Lakes auto production area. Since 1965 in Oshawa, the cars we've produced, 85% of them have been sold in the United States as a result of the Auto Pact, which led to the US FTA, which led to NAFTA, Madam Speaker. We are integrated. So if Windsor faces a new input cost or rising pressures or payroll taxes, and they don't across the border in Michigan, that's a competitive issue that we can't let happen when there's a Great Lakes region for auto production. It's the same with the carbon tax, Madam Speaker. The government recognized that and exempted emitters like the auto industry from it, but they didn't exempt small to medium-sized ones. And so they knew there was going to be continued upward cost pressure from supply chain networks within Ontario, Madam Speaker. Is that part of it? Can we delay the implementation of this tax, Madam Speaker? That should be something we talk about. The timing is also, I would be amiss if I didn't reference the fact that I've had concerns for over a year with the NAFTA discussions, Madam Speaker. In the minister's speech that she gave last summer, or 2 summers ago at the University of Ottawa, outlining Canada's objectives for a renegotiated NAFTA, she did not mention the auto industry. We know the so-called progressive agenda, but we didn't hear about the auto industry. And Madam Speaker, there would be no free trade between Canada and the US but for the auto industry. At the time, I said consistently, get auto right and the rest will fall in line. And 6 months later in January, when they proposed a new part calculation approach for the North American, the Great Lakes, and now Mexico auto production industry, I praised that at the time, Madam Speaker. Get auto right between Canada and the US, and the rest of our trade concerns will follow. We didn't see that. And in fact, we saw 232 security tariffs applied towards steel and aluminum. That has impacted General Motors. That has impacted their suppliers. A lot of parts, Madam Speaker, and chassis development is stamped steel. Much of that steel is from the United States. So what we've seen is months of prolonged tariffs. We've seen now Canadian retaliatory tariffs actually hurting Canadians, much more than they impact the US. I don't mind putting a tariff on bourbon, although I have friends that like bourbon, Madam Speaker, because the LCBO buys bourbon. It's a state monopoly in Ontario, Madam Speaker. But to put in retaliatory tariffs when we know they're going to hurt Canadian manufacturers more than the US, the intended target of this retaliation, that's dumb policy, Madam Speaker. They said they would be nimble and adapt. Was that part of it? So as you can tell, Madam Speaker, I said from the beginning, my personal connection here through my family, the fact that I remember in grade school at St. Joseph's, most of the parents of my friends, either directly or indirectly, were touched by or had a parent working at General Motors, Madam Speaker. So this strikes at our community. So I don't want to attach blame. Let's come up with a plan to make ourselves competitive. And let's not just wait for them to come to us, Madam Speaker, because I know full well the government knew there were risks here before yesterday. The pace and quantity of meetings showed there were concerns about competitive operations. The minister has said, Mr. Speaker, every time he met with GM's president, he would mention, what about Oshawa? Well, what about Oshawa, Madam Speaker? What are we doing to make sure this isn't the first of big manufacturing jobs in Ontario that is now saying, after payroll taxes, after carbon taxes, after wage rate pressures, after tariffs, after trade uncertainty, that they may start looking at other jurisdictions. Let's address those issues, Madam Speaker. So this is an opportunity where if the Liberals don't turn the page but come up with a plan addressing some of these underlying risks, we will be there shoulder to shoulder to address these issues, because I believe in manufacturing, Madam Speaker. We have the best and most highly skilled workforce. We're innovators. We've got a heritage. We've got access to markets. We've got great colleges and universities. We just need to be competitive within the Great Lakes market and with our U.S. neighbors. And when they're making moves, we can't go in the opposite direction, raising taxes and regulation. So I hope with this emergency debate we show our support for the families impacted, but also show them that until a lock is put on the gate, I'm going to be looking for ways that we can showcase the opportunity in Oshawa, address some of the underlying competitive issues that must have gone into the inclusion of Oshawa in this list, and show that we stand with the workers, Madam Speaker.
Bravo.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Whitby.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank my honourable colleague for his speech. Of course, we share his sentiments. Our government is deeply disappointed by GM's decision to close the plant in Oshawa at the end of next year. Madam Speaker, the honourable colleague spoke about wanting to understand the decisions, what factors were underpinning the decision for GM to make this announcement. We do know that GM has made the decision to close 8 plants, Oshawa, Detroit, Ohio, Maryland, in Korea, and 2 other plants outside of North America. We do know that from what they've said to us, what they've said in their letter, what they've said publicly, is that it's based on decisions that the company has been making for the last 4 years to move to towards more autonomous vehicles. The plant in St. Catharines, we know, opened around the same time as the Oshawa plant. The Ingersoll plant is staying intact. Madam Speaker, my question is more of a comment, Madam Speaker, to know that we all want to ensure that the people of Oshawa and the Durham region stay protected, and we'll continue to work together with our honourable colleagues to ensure that that does happen.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the member from Whitby for taking part of this debate. I think it's appropriate she asked me the first question. She knows, as I do, my colleague, the MP for Oshawa, is on the ground in Oshawa tonight, as will be the leader of the official opposition. So I'm glad that she's part of this debate, because we should, as a team, address the issues here. As she said, there are several other plants in the Great Lakes Basin impacted. But there was a decision made, Madam Speaker, and what I'd like to see this debate lead to is a discussion of some of the issues that I know would have been part of the decision. Tariffs, trade uncertainty, vehicle types, a move to zero emission, zero collision. I think without spending any money, because the bailout in 2009 was a totally different scenario, I think addressing some of the policy decisions that went into the decision by General Motors to say, despite a century, we don't see Oshawa Assembly as part of our next 10 to 25 years. I think we can address some of those things on a nonpartisan and on a provincial federal basis, working with Mayor Henry, who's soon to be regional chair Henry, Mayor Dan Carter, to make it a 3-level full court press so that we show we're getting the balance right in Oshawa, because we don't want to see other towns hit like Oshawa was today.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Hamilton Mountain.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank the member from Durham for joining us tonight on this emergency debate, and his heartfelt speech and his personal touch that he has with this. I think it's very, very important. We know that the city of Oshawa has been hit hard today, but I would ask the member, would he support, and I think he's answered this already, but with other people, support an all-party at the federal level committee, joining the all-party provincial committee along with the union, the mayor, and the union or the company, of sitting down ASAP, because we got a short time span because it's a very short notice. Would he support that and joining, and we'll all sit down and try to find out the resolution?
The member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the member from Hamilton Mountain in bringing this with me tonight, the emergency debate. And in fact, that's the very reason we're here. The first all-party consensus we can drive is in this chamber, Madam Speaker. And by the NDP echoing a lot of my concerns, and by the Liberals also asking for an emergency debate, I think there's a willingness. I've been speaking in the last 18 hours, Madam Speaker, since the rumors started coming out with my provincial counterparts, including Jennifer French, the MPP from Oshawa, Minister Todd Smith, and Minister Peter Bethenfeldvey, members of Premier Ford's team. We need an all-hands-on-deck approach here. And as I said, Madam Speaker, this isn't just saying there's a fund out there you can apply from. This is a decision that was made by Oshawa because of a number of existing conditions on the ground. If we can address those on an all-party basis, I think we have the time to not turn the page and just say we need to work on retraining. Let's make Oshawa competitive so that we remain in operation.
The honourable member for Prince Albert.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank the member from Durham for being here tonight. I'm here to support him, just like he's been there to support us out west in the oil and gas sector, the forestry sector. You know, Madam Speaker, in 3 years, it's amazing what this government's done to the Canadian economy. Forestry sector hanging on by its fingernails, literally. If it wasn't for hurricanes in the U.S., we'd see massive layoffs there. The oil and gas sector out in Saskatchewan and Alberta, hundreds of thousands of people laid off. Again, just a total disaster. And now manufacturing. This summer we've been doing roundtables across Canada, and manufacturers have been telling us we're not competitive, we can't compete. We can't be based in Canada with these tariffs. We can't be based in Canada based on these regulations. We can't compete. The Trade Committee has been hearing this over and over again in its testimony. Madam Speaker, the Environment Minister comes out and says, well, we're going to embrace these new green jobs. We're going to replace these oil and gas jobs with all these new green jobs. Yet in his speech, he talked about Oshawa. That would be a perfect place to see some of these green jobs actually happen. Can you explain to me what's going on so that this is not happening in Oshawa?
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Thank to my friend from Prince Albert. As he knows, the MP for Oshawa and myself just a few months ago hosted an energy executive in Oshawa to highlight the opportunity for our manufacturing sector, particularly small and medium-sized players, to do contracts in our resource sector. As I said in my speech, the success of one region and one industry is a Canadian success. We can't pit one against one another. We have to support jobs in communities, Madam Speaker. He's highlighted the fact that I think if their move is zero emission, zero collision, with GM's history, with our university in the Durham region, with the clean greenhouse gas emission-free generation in Darlington, Madam Speaker, we have an opportunity with the flexible line in Oshawa to actually come up with the vehicles that GM says the consumers want. It will be much harder for other plants in Ohio and Michigan to retool. We have the flexibility to move quickly, but we have to show leadership to show that we want the jobs of the next 20 years, not just the last 20.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for London Fanshawe.
Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his remarks. And certainly he has a great deal of experience in regard to this community and the people who live there. One of the things that has been troubling me a great deal is the fact that in 2009, the Canadian auto sector was in difficulty because of recession, and at that point in time, the Government of Canada loaned $10.85 billion to that industry, and certainly General Motors was a recipient. What troubles me, Madam Speaker, is that it seems that the requirements of General Motors providing jobs, staying in the community, only lasted till 2016. It would seem to me that $10.85 billion should have been the basis of a requirement for something far more secure than just that short time. And I wondered if my colleague would comment on that.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the member for London Fanshawe, and she certainly knows the heritage of the old GM Defence Company in London as well, Madam Speaker. 2009 is a great question. There was going to be insolvencies, so not just hundreds of thousands of jobs, all the retirees. I remind my friend from Hamilton Mountain, he can still vote for Bill C-405, which came out of concern from General Motors pensioners about less flexibility, because they were worried that all pensioners would be left out. We don't have an insolvency here, But the requirement of 16% to be produced, Madam Speaker, I spoke to Mark Cameron, who was in the Prime Minister's office at the time. That was the result of the negotiation. At the time of the bailout, 16% was how much was being produced in Canada, Madam Speaker. As part of Canadian participation in the province of Ontario, they maintained that, and that was the longest time period for vehicle cycles going out several that could be agreed to. And that, I'd remind that member, on an urgent basis to prevent a massive failure, Madam Speaker. So I think Parliament has acted before to address the shock from the great global recession. Now is a time to address the signal being sent that our manufacturing environment in Ontario has some underlying competitiveness issues. The small mini budget a few days ago by the Finance Minister is not enough to address some of the concerns that have been there since payroll tax increases and others. Let's use this debate tonight to come up with a plan to address some of these underlying competitiveness issues.